It was midweek at Bettermart, the kind of evening where everything moved at breakneck speed. Shoppers weaved through aisles, their carts overflowing with groceries. The rhythm of the store was a comforting hum of beeping scanners, murmured conversations, and rolling cartwheels. Sophie Harper, the 29-year-old manager known for her efficiency and strong principles, stood near the checkout lanes, keeping a watchful eye on operations. Dressed in her crisp uniform, Sophie exuded confidence. To her, managing Bettermart wasn't just about ensuring smooth transactions. It was about creating a space that reflected her values: kindness, inclusivity, and integrity. Her upbringing had taught her to stand firm in her beliefs, even when it wasn't easy. Then he walked in. An elderly man with a gentle, deliberate gait entered the store, leaning slightly on a polished wooden cane. His face was lined with years of life, his eyes calm yet piercing. But it wasn't his age or his demeanor that caught Sophie's attention. It was the bold red MAGA hat perched atop his head. The white lettering seemed to shout in the fluorescent lighting. Sophie's jaw tightened. That hat wasn't just a piece of clothing to her, it was a statement, a symbol. It dredged up memories she had worked hard to suppress: arguments at the dinner table, fiery protests, and sleepless nights spent scrolling through divisive debates online. As the man approached checkout, Sophie felt her pulse quicken. He placed a few items on the conveyor belt: a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, and a tin of coffee. Nothing unusual. But Sophie couldn't ignore the burning discomfort rising in her chest. Steeling herself, she stepped forward, intercepting the transaction. Her voice was calm but firm, each word deliberate. "Excuse me, sir," she said, meeting his gaze. "I'm sorry, but I can't serve you while you're wearing that hat." The man's movements paused. He looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fade, the chatter of shoppers, the hum of activity, the endless beeping of scanners. "I see," he said softly, his voice calm but questioning. "And why's that?" Sophie squared her shoulders. "Because that hat represents division and hate. I can't allow it in this store. We stand for better values here." There was no anger in the man's response, just a slow, measured exhale. "You're sure about this?" "Yes," Sophie replied, her tone unwavering. The man nodded, collected his items without another word, and turned to leave. He moved with a quiet dignity that made Sophie's stomach twist, though she refused to let it show. Just before stepping through the automatic doors, he paused and glanced back, his voice steady yet laced with meaning. "You might regret this decision." The doors closed behind him with a soft hiss, and Sophie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A small sense of pride welled up. She had stood her ground. But as she turned back toward the checkout lanes, she noticed something unsettling. Her team wasn't smiling in support. Instead, they exchanged nervous glances, and the air was thick with tension. A cashier leaned over, her voice low but urgent. "Do you know who that was?" Sophie frowned. "No, just another customer." The cashier's eyes widened. That wasn't just any customer. That was Walter Gaines. The name hit Sophie like a punch to the chest. She blinked, confused. "Who's Walter Gaines?" The cashier hesitated, then whispered, "He's the founder of Bettermart, the man who built this company from the ground up." Sophie's heart sank. Her mind raced back to his parting words, "You might regret this decision." Suddenly they felt less like a passing comment and more like a warning. As Sophie stood frozen, staring at the closed doors, a thought clawed its way into her mind. What have I done? Little did she know, the fallout from this single act was only just beginning. Before we dive into the next part of this incredible story, we want to hear from you. If you're enjoying it so far, comment 2 below. If not, let us know with a 7. Your feedback helps us grow. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for elderly wisdom, more thought-provoking tales like this one. Let's keep the story rolling. The air in the store felt heavier as Sophie processed what she had just heard. Walter Gaines, the founder of Bettermart? The man who had just walked out in silence, wearing that hat, was the very person responsible for creating the company she now managed. Sophie's mind raced. How could she have not recognized him? Her confidence wavered as she replayed the confrontation in her head, now laced with doubt. Moments later, her thoughts were interrupted by the shrill ring of her office phone. It was Evelyn Cross, the district manager. "Sophie." Evelyn's tone was clipped, her words sharp and precise. "I need you in my office tomorrow morning. We need to talk about what happened today." The rest of Sophie's shift felt like a blur. The once proud resolve she'd felt earlier was now replaced by a gnawing anxiety. As she clocked out that evening, her co-workers whispered among themselves, casting curious glances in her direction. Sophie couldn't shake the knot tightening in her stomach. That night she scoured the internet, searching for anything she could find about Walter Gaines. What she discovered left her breathless. Walter wasn't just the founder of Bettermart, he was a local hero. Headlines celebrated his contributions to the community, funding food banks, organizing scholarships, and employing hundreds of people across the region. Then, one article stopped Sophie in her tracks. It explained how Walter's MAGA hat was more than a political statement. It was a tribute to his late son, a Marine who had proudly worn the hat before his passing. Sophie stared at the screen, her chest tightening with guilt. She had been so focused on her assumptions about what the hat represented that she hadn't even considered the person wearing it. The next morning, Sophie arrived at Evelyn's office with a mix of dread and determination. Evelyn wasted no time, her expression unreadable as she gestured for Sophie to sit. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" Evelyn began, her voice steady but firm. Sophie opened her mouth to explain, but Evelyn continued. "Walter Gaines isn't just a customer, Sophie. He's the reason you even have this job. He built this company on principles of respect and inclusivity. Your actions yesterday violated everything Bettermart stands for." Sophie sat frozen, her throat dry. I didn't know," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's not the point," Evelyn said, leaning forward. "Your job is to treat every customer with dignity, regardless of your personal feelings. Walter has every right to demand your immediate termination." Sophie's heart sank. Was this it? Had she ruined her career over a split-second decision? "But," Evelyn added, her tone softening slightly, "Walter doesn't want to fire you. Instead, he's requested that you reflect on your actions and complete a training program on customer relations and inclusivity. After that, he's willing to give you another chance. He believes in second chances, Sophie. You should be grateful for that." Grateful didn't begin to describe what Sophie felt as she left Evelyn's office. She had been given an opportunity to make things right, but the weight of her actions still pressed heavily on her shoulders. As she walked to her car, Walter's words echoed in her mind, "You might regret this decision." He had been right, but maybe, just maybe, she could turn this regret into something meaningful. And yet, she couldn't shake the question, would an apology be enough to mend the damage she'd done? Sophie spent the rest of the day grappling with a whirlwind of emotions, shame, guilt, and an overwhelming need to make things right. The thought of facing Walter again sent a pang of anxiety through her chest, but there was something deeper now, a sense of responsibility she couldn't ignore. As she sat in her small apartment that evening, she opened her laptop and began digging deeper into Walter Gaines's life. The more she read, the heavier her guilt grew. Walter wasn't just the founder of Bettermart. He was a man who had dedicated decades to lifting up the very community Sophie called home. There were photos of him at charity drives, handing out meals at homeless shelters, and standing proudly with scholarship recipients. One particular interview stopped her in her tracks. In it, Walter spoke about his late son, a Marine who had served his country with unwavering dedication. "This hat," Walter had said, his voice breaking slightly, "isn't about politics for me. It's about honoring my son's memory. He wore it proudly because he believed in service, in loyalty, and in standing up for what's right, and I'll keep wearing it for him." Sophie's chest tightened, and tears stung her eyes. She had been so blinded by her assumptions that she hadn't even considered the possibility of a deeper meaning behind the hat. Her actions hadn't just disrespected a customer, they had dishonored a grieving father's tribute to his son. For the first time in a long while, Sophie felt small. She had always prided herself on being someone who stood for justice and kindness, but now she couldn't help but question whether her ideals had clouded her judgment. Had she been so focused on what she thought was right that she failed to see the humanity in others? Sophie knew what she had to do. Apologizing to Walter wasn't just about saving her job, it was about doing the right thing, even if it was uncomfortable. She reached for her phone and dialed Evelyn. "I'd like to meet with Mr. Gaines," Sophie said, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach. "I need to apologize to him in person." The next morning, Evelyn arranged the meeting at a quiet cafe on the edge of town. Sophie arrived early, clutching a notebook filled with everything she wanted to say. She rehearsed her words over and over, but no matter how many times she practiced, the knot in her stomach wouldn't go away. When Walter walked in, Sophie felt her breath catch. He looked just as calm and composed as he had in the store, the bright red hat perched firmly on his head. He approached the table and extended his hand. "Sophie," he said, his tone polite but guarded. "Mr. Gaines," Sophie replied, shaking his hand. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me." Walter nodded and sat down, folding his hands neatly on the table. "I'm here because I believe in giving people the chance to learn from their mistakes," he said. "So, let's talk. What do you have to say?" Sophie took a deep breath. The moment of truth had arrived. "I owe you an apology," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "When I saw your hat, I let my personal biases take over. I made assumptions about you without knowing who you are or what you stand for. That was wrong, and I deeply regret it." Walter's expression remained neutral as he listened, his eyes studying her intently. "I've learned more about you since then," Sophie continued, her voice growing steadier. "I know now that your hat is about honoring your son, not about politics. I let my emotions cloud my judgment, and I disrespected you in a way that was unfair and unprofessional. I'm truly sorry." There was a long pause. Sophie's heart pounded in the silence, each second stretching endlessly. Finally, Walter leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. "Thank you for saying that," he said. "I won't lie to you, Sophie. Your actions hurt. Not because of what you said, but because you didn't take the time to see me as a person. That's something too many people do these days. Judge first, ask questions later." Sophie nodded, tears pricking the corners of her eyes. "I understand that now, and I want to do better." Walter gave a small smile, one filled with a quiet wisdom that only time could bring. "We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do afterward. I'll accept your apology, but I hope you carry this lesson with you. Respect isn't about agreeing with someone, it's about recognizing their humanity." Sophie swallowed hard, his words striking a chord deep within her. "I will," she promised. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Walter nodded, standing up and extending his hand again. "I believe in second chances, Sophie. Don't waste it." As he walked out of the cafe, Sophie sat for a moment, absorbing everything that had just happened. She felt lighter somehow, as though a burden had been lifted. But she also knew this was just the beginning. It was time to prove, not just to Walter, but to herself, that she could turn this mistake into something meaningful. And this time, she wouldn't let assumptions get in the way of seeing people for who they truly were. Sophie left the cafe feeling a mix of relief and determination. Walter's words echoed in her mind. Respect isn't about agreeing with someone, it's about recognizing their humanity. For someone who had always prided herself on her principles, the lesson felt both humbling and transformative. She knew this wasn't just about redeeming herself in Walter's eyes, it was about becoming a better person, both professionally and personally. The next day, Sophie returned to Bettermart for the first time since the incident. Evelyn had cleared her to begin sensitivity training before resuming her position as manager. As she walked into the store, she couldn't ignore the hushed murmurs among her co-workers. Some cast her sympathetic glances, while others looked skeptical, as if unsure whether she deserved a second chance. Sophie squared her shoulders. She wasn't here to win them over with words. She'd let her actions speak. The training sessions were more eye-opening than she had expected. Sophie sat through hours of workshops on communication, unconscious bias, and active listening. One exercise stood out in particular. Participants were asked to write down a time when they had been judged unfairly. As Sophie scribbled her own story, a memory resurfaced. An instance when a teacher had dismissed her for speaking out during a debate in high school. She remembered the sting of being reduced to a single action, as if her entire character had been overshadowed by one moment. That memory hit her like a lightning bolt. This is what Walter must have felt, she thought, to be dismissed without a chance to explain himself. As the training concluded, Sophie felt a renewed sense of clarity. She wasn't just learning to be a better manager, she was learning to be a better human being. But there was one more step she needed to take: addressing her team. Standing before her co-workers in the staff lounge, Sophie took a deep breath. Their faces were a mix of curiosity and skepticism, but she pushed forward. "I want to thank all of you for sticking with me during this time," she began. "I know my actions have caused tension here, and I take full responsibility for that. I let my personal feelings cloud my judgment, and in doing so, I failed to represent the values this store and all of you stand for." Her voice wavered slightly, but she pressed on. "I've learned a lot in the past few weeks. Most importantly, I've learned that true leadership isn't about being right all the time. It's about listening, understanding, and respecting the people we serve and work alongside. I promise to do better moving forward, not just as your manager, but as your teammate." For a moment, the room was silent. Then, one of the senior cashiers, a kind but blunt woman named Linda, spoke up. "Takes guts to admit when you're wrong, Sophie. I respect that." A few murmurs of agreement followed, and Sophie felt the tension in the room begin to ease. The shift back to normalcy wasn't immediate, but it was steady. Sophie made it a point to check in with her team regularly, listening to their concerns and incorporating their feedback into her decisions. Slowly but surely, the trust she had lost began to rebuild. One afternoon, a familiar figure walked into the store, Walter Gaines. This time, Sophie didn't feel the pang of anxiety she once had. Instead, she saw an opportunity, a chance to show him that his faith in her hadn't been misplaced. Walter was browsing the produce section when Sophie approached him. "Mr. Gaines," she said warmly, "welcome back. Can I help you find anything today?" Walter turned to her with a faint smile, tipping his hat slightly. "Sophie," he said, "I see you're back on the floor. How's it been going?" "It's been a learning experience," Sophie admitted, "but a good one. I've been working to earn back the trust I lost, starting with my team." Walter nodded approvingly. "Good. Remember, respect and humility go a long way. You're on the right path." As Walter made his way to the checkout, Sophie watched him with a sense of quiet gratitude. This wasn't just a redemption story for her. It was a reminder that everyone carries their own struggles, their own stories. And it was her job, not just as a manager, but as a person, to honor those stories, even when they didn't align with her own. That night, as Sophie reflected on her journey, she realized something profound. The moments that challenge us the most are the ones that shape us the most. She had made a mistake, a big one, but she had also been given a chance to grow, and she wasn't going to waste it. And so, with renewed purpose, Sophie Harper prepared for the road ahead, knowing that while she couldn't change the past, she could build a better future, one respectful interaction at a time. The weeks that followed were a turning point for Sophie Harper. With every shift she managed, she worked harder to embody the values she had once overlooked. Respect wasn't just a word anymore, it was a practice. Every customer who walked through the doors of Bettermart was greeted with a genuine smile, no matter what they wore or what Sophie thought about their beliefs. She had learned to listen, to pause, and to see the person behind the first impression. Sophie also implemented changes that went beyond her personal growth. She introduced a new training program for her team, focused on empathy and inclusivity. The sessions encouraged employees to share their own experiences and discuss how to better serve their diverse community. At first, there was hesitation. Some employees didn't believe the training was necessary. Others thought it was just for show. But Sophie's vulnerability during these sessions, her willingness to admit her past mistakes, set the tone. "I know I've failed in the past," Sophie said during one meeting, her voice steady but earnest. "And I want to thank all of you for giving me the chance to learn from it. If we're going to make this store a place that truly serves our community, it starts with all of us respecting each other, no matter our differences." The impact was undeniable. Team morale began to improve. Customers noticed the difference too, leaving positive feedback about how welcoming the store felt. For Sophie, the most rewarding part wasn't the praise. It was seeing her team take ownership of the store's renewed culture. But her biggest test came one Saturday afternoon when a customer walked in wearing a MAGA hat. The sight made her pause, not from judgment, but from the reminder of how far she had come. The man was younger than Walter, with a sharp tone and little patience as he searched for an item. Sophie watched as a cashier struggled to de-escalate the man's frustration. Without hesitation, Sophie stepped in. "Good afternoon, sir," she said with a calm smile. "It looks like you're having some trouble. Can I help?" The man turned to her, his expression softening slightly at her tone. "Yeah, I've been trying to find that stupid barbecue sauce your store advertised," he said, exasperated. Sophie nodded. "I think I know the one. Let me grab it for you." She returned a moment later with the sauce, handing it to the man. "Here you go. I'm sorry for the trouble," she said sincerely. The man seemed taken aback. "Thanks," he muttered, glancing at her name tag. "Sophie, right? You're the manager?" "Yes, I am," she replied. "Well, you're doing a good job here." "Thanks for the help," he said, tipping his hat slightly before heading to checkout. As the man walked away, Sophie felt a quiet pride, not because she had smoothed over a tense situation, but because she had done so without judgment or hesitation. It was a simple interaction, but it symbolized how much she had changed. That evening, Sophie received a message from Walter. It was brief but meaningful. "I stopped by the store today. The atmosphere has improved, and I can see your hard work. Keep it up." Sophie stared at the message, a smile spreading across her face. She didn't need grand gestures or accolades. Knowing that she was making a difference, little by little, was enough. As the weeks turned into months, Sophie became a trusted leader at Bettermart. Employees came to her not just with work-related concerns, but with personal ones, seeking advice or simply a listening ear. Customers began to recognize her as the friendly face of the store, and Walter, though he rarely visited, remained a quiet supporter, watching from the sidelines as Sophie rebuilt what she had almost lost. One day, as Sophie was locking up after closing, she stood in the quiet stillness of the store and reflected on her journey. She realized that the lessons she had learned weren't just about work, they were about life. Respect, humility, and the willingness to grow weren't just professional values, they were human ones. And while she couldn't undo the past, she could honor it by continuing to move forward, one respectful interaction at a time. Before leaving, she sent one final message to Walter. "Thank you for believing in second chances. I won't waste it." Walter's reply came almost immediately. "I never doubted you, Sophie. Keep paying it forward." As Sophie locked the doors and stepped into the cool evening air, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in a long time. This wasn't just the end of a chapter, it was the beginning of a better one. What do you think about Sophie's journey? Do you believe in the power of second chances, or do you think her actions should have had different consequences? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If this story touched your heart or made you reflect, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Elderly Wisdom for more inspiring tales like this one. Every like, comment, and subscription helps us bring you more stories of growth, redemption, and the incredible lessons life has to offer. Thanks for listening, and remember, every mistake is an opportunity to learn and grow. See you in the next story.